This week on the show, we'll recap our vBSDcon experiences from last week, give you the story behind the PF errata notice, we reminisce in Solaris memories, and show you how to configure different desktop environments on FreeBSD. BSD Now, episode 212, the Solaris Eclipse, recorded on the 13th of September 2017. Hi, I'm your host, Benedikt Reuschling.
And I'm Alan Jude.
And we've a little bit of time between two conferences, so we have time to record this episode for you this week. Next week, we're going to be at EuroBSDcon, and last week we were at vBSDcon, which brings us right into our headlines for this week. vBSDcon.
Indeed. So when you're seeing this will come out while we're at EuroBSDcon, so it will actually be relatively timely compared to some of the episodes recently because of the schedule has been a little erratic lately. But anyway, vBSDcon was held September 7th through 9th. If you missed it, I'm so sorry for you. So we recorded this a few days after we got home from that, so everything's mostly still fresh in our minds, although sleep deprivation really does seem to impede the formation of long-term memory.
Yeah, there are side effects.
Things started off on Wednesday night as attendees that were going to be at the Thursday Developer Summit arrived and broke into smallish groups for disorganized dinner and drinks. It was nice to meet up with people I hadn't seen in a while and get to have nice conversations with them and so on. And after everybody was well fed and lubricated, we held an unofficial hacker lounge. We just found a little bench and a bunch of chairs in a corner by the elevator bank, and it had electricity, and therefore it was the hacker lounge. We get to sit around and talk to people and find out what's going on and just catch up and maybe do a little bit of work. It was good, although it broke up relatively early as, that developer summit starts awfully early tomorrow morning. And most of us had just flown in, and many of us, not me in this case, but a number of people, had come from different time zones and we're going to need a little bit of extra sleep. Yeah, pro tip for the conference, bank all the sleep you can. So, especially the first couple days, try to get to sleep. Then the Developers Summit started Thursday morning with a nice light breakfast provided by the VeriSign. EdMass started us off, got us all introduced, and we went around and introduced ourselves and talked a bit about what we were interested in. And then Glenn Barber gave a presentation about the lessons learned from the 11.1 release cycle and comparing it to previous release cycles. Especially since 11.1 was released on time and one of the best releases so far, it was very interesting to compare it to both the 11.0, but the 10.2 and 10.3 release cycles. In particular, it seems to be useful to not have too many last-minute patches going in, as you might expect.
Yeah, it was a good discussion we had, and questions about improvements and how we can help and things like that.
There's the slides for Glenn's talk are available on the Dev Summit wiki. The group of developers then jumped into hackmd.io, which is like a collaborative note-taking app or something kind of like Google Docs, but not, and in Markdown. And we collectively created a list of various works in progress that people have and discussed them and upstreaming efforts, code people have completed but haven't managed to get into FreeBSD yet. And then we moved on to the typical wants and needs session where we talked about what people would like to see happen and what they really need to see in time for the 12 release. And then we had an excellent lunch provided by VeriSign again. And then we broke up into pairs for the working group, pairs of working groups. So we had 2 large rooms for working groups, as well as a couple of smaller spaces for meeting style things. The first pair were Zfs and Toolchain. I went to the Zfs session, and we talked about a number of recent developments and in particular some issues that are being looked at, and how we can be more aggressive with ZFS and adopt some of the under review features sooner to help make FreeBSD the place to look when you want the new features in ZFS, but also to help the open ZFS ecosystem overall by testing some of these features in anger and making sure that they work and working out the bugs so they can be committed sooner and be available on all the platforms. I wasn't in the toolchain group, but they should have taken notes, so maybe you can find out what happened there.
Yeah. So I stayed in the main room where all the conference talks are going to be the next 2 days, talking with the various people and doing some documentation-related stuff and behind-the-scenes work.
Yep. The next group we're going to be iflib, which is a library for writing network drivers. The idea is to reduce the amount of boilerplate code and repeated code that has to be in every driver to make it easier for vendors to write drivers for FreeBSD and network drivers in general. The parallel session was going to be about the network stack and TCP, specifically because the iflib group didn't want to get bogged down talking about the rest of the network stack or TCP IP, but pretty much everyone ended up in the iflib discussion for that one. Sean took good notes, and those are already up on the wiki. And then after another break with snacks and so on provided by VeriSign, the last groups of the day met, and we had a package-based discussion and another one about secure boot. So I was in the package-based session, especially Brad and Glenn Barber, myself, Gordon Tetlow, the security officer, and so on, discussed some of the issues and how to work through them and, finish off the remaining problems to make package-based usable. And then in the secure boot session, I wasn't there, but I know Eric McCorkle was talking about his work, and so we have the agreements and so on in place to have Microsoft sign a shim loader so that we can actually support BIOS secure boot. But before they will do that, we need to show the process of how that loader will securely load the kernel and the drivers and the operating system. That code doesn't exist yet. But Eric has some work in progress for that, and so do some people at Juniper, and we're trying to mesh those two things together and come up with a process and get the code written.
Okay. Yeah, seems like we're on a good path to getting it integrated into the system.
Yeah. And then from 6 to 8 p.m. On Thursday night, there was the welcome reception. So anybody who was attending the conference, in particular, many of the people coming just for the conference only arrived then. There was it was a nice standing dinner with food, and there was sushi and everything. It was very nice. It was a great way to meet new people. If you were new to the conference, it was great to be able to just walk in the room and everybody's just milling around, open to conversation. So it was very easy to introduce yourself and get to know some people, meet some people, and so on, and just to mingle and socialize and find out what's going on and kind of dip your toe in the waters, as it were. Then the official hacking lounge Thursday night was quite busy. It was very nice. I didn't actually even bring my laptop when I came back from being out and so on. I just sat around and listened to some storytelling that was going on about various adventures people had in the industry and so on. And it was very entertaining. I very much enjoy even just sitting around listening to these kinds of technical war stories and fun stories. There was actually a bit of talk about, since hurricanes were in the news, there was some adventures that people had in New York during Hurricane Sandy, and working in data centers at the time and so on, trying to keep things online during a hurricane. It was also very encouraging. There was a new developer who was working on porting a Realtek wireless driver from Linux to FreeBSD, and we're running into some problems just dealing with the build system on FreeBSD and so on because they were very unfamiliar with it. But watching, them being assisted by a very seasoned veteran developer, it's interesting when the new person doesn't know very many people yet and doesn't realize how big of a figure it is that is lending them a hand. But watching the new developer's eyes light up as that little bit of extra information filled in some gaps, and then suddenly everything clicked and it all made sense, and watch the developer then race off and make a bunch of progress now that one little hurdle had been overcome with just a couple of tips from someone who's been there before. That was very inspirational and reminded me, why these conferences are so important. Is part of the reason I like hacker lounges so much is because, I'm relatively new to a lot of this programming stuff. And sometimes I end up with these tiny little questions that anybody who's had some experience in this area could answer off the top of their head. But trying to research it and figure it out myself is a lot more effort.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's much more direct and, very
low latency.
The details some people remember is always fascinating.
Well, yes, actually, another story like that happened to me myself. I was digging through the code in the kernel that mounts the root file system before single user mode starts, because I wanted to set it up so that I could mount an additional list of file systems at that time, so that, for example, the etc file system could live in a separate ZFS dataset. Mm-hmm. And it was getting a little hairy. The code in there was very persnickety and so on. But then my friend Dylan was sitting beside me and he was like, I remember doing something like what you're after, but I didn't have to modify any of the code. And then a little spelunking in the code for the init binary popped up these variables you can set, including init_script, which is a script that's run. It's originally was designed to be used to set up a chroot for a kind of a previous version of the reroute support that has been vastly improved since. But it allows you to run a script very early before etcrc runs, so that in this case I could mount the etc so that it wasn't empty. And with that little bit of information, suddenly I wrote 2 lines of shell script and my problem was solved and I didn't have to go modify the kernel and so on. So that was very interesting. And then I was telling this story and then people were researching what it was originally for. And then that led to the developer who added the feature 10-ish years ago to go and mark it as deprecated because it had been replaced by this reroute support. And it's like, actually, no, could you not? I'm using that now. I've just, at work this week, we've started to convert our servers over to using this mechanism so that we can use this new upgrade process I've been working on. And hopefully I'll get to talk a little bit more about that at EuroBSDcon.
Excellent. Yeah, that would be interesting because, we've seen reroute developed and it works apparently, but we haven't seen many people use it or how-tos around it.
Well, in my case, I'm not going to actually use it. But although I have used it on MIPS, I have these little MIPS boards and they only have, 8 or 16 megabytes of storage. So you can't fit very much of a file system on there. But you can fit a basic one. So I have it boot off that. And then if there is a USB stick inserted that has a file system on it, it will reroute onto that. So it boots up into a very minimal system. If there's a full system attached, it reroutes. So that's not reload the kernel, but just shut down everything and start init off the new root mount point and switches over to using the USB stick. But if it's not attached, you still get a system that comes up rather than hard depending on the USB stick being inserted.
Okay.
I was also talking recently with Olivier Robert about using a very similar mechanism for encrypted disk. So he has a server that's remote that he doesn't have physical hands on, but he wants to encrypt the disk. Having a small file system that boots up and lets him SSH in, decrypt his file system by entering the passphrase, and then reroute onto it will basically reboot the system into the encrypted file system. But still, if it gets reset, he can still SSH in and enter the passphrase. So yes, reroute seems to work very well for the use cases I've tried it with, and I'm very glad it's there. But this remnants of this other thing allows me to do some interesting things.
So it has to remain there?
Yes. And Warner has graciously unannounced the deprecation for it. That happened within a couple hours. Anyway, so the Hacker Lounge shut down relatively early again because the conference proper started at 8:45 a.m. sharp the next day. And so, I know I wanted to get up by at least 8 to try to get some breakfast in before that. It was a very nice breakfast, by the way. Then Friday saw a string of great presentations. I think my favorite was actually Jonathan Anderson's talk about oblivious sandboxing. Not just because of my own personal interest in Capsicum, but just Jonathan's a very energetic speaker and was able to keep everyone focused even when he was doing relatively complicated explanations of how his oblivious sandboxing stuff will work.
Mm-hmm.
It was a great day. There was quite a schedule and had Michael Dexter talking about how to build and test virtual and hardware instances to try everything. Kyle Knissel talking about the BSD community and the dynamics and how we get users from FreeNAS. Sam Guider talked about the history and future of core dumps. Clifford William talked about using package source for multi-platform deployments. So that was how to have the same set of packages on, FreeBSD, Red Hat Enterprise Linux, and HP-UX. And it's very handy if you can run the same version of Python on all of those.
Yeah.
We had BOF sessions. I ran a BOF on ZFS. Lots of questions and just discussing what's coming up and so on. Then Jonathan's talk, and then Semi Bahara talked about modern multi-core synchronization with Concurrency Kit, a library that's been imported into FreeBSD that will make it easier to, or provides more advanced locking primitives to do multiprocessor work very well.
Yep. I wasn't at all of these talks. I spent a little bit of time at the foundation table talking to people and handing out stickers and pens and all that stuff.
Yep. There was, again, disorganized dinner on Friday. So a bunch of us met up in the lobby and went out to a restaurant called Big Bowl, which is like a stir-fry bar. So you decide on a protein. I had some nice chicken with the sauce, like teriyaki, and some rice. And then you get a bowl and you go up to their little salad bar looking thing and pick out all the ingredients that you want for your stir-fry. And then you submit the bowl with a little piece of paper that says, what kind of meat and sauce and so on you want on it. And shortly after, your dinner arrives, and it's all made up nice. It was very good. It was also nice to have a mixed group. We had some Openbsd people, some developers, and some users mixed in there. So it resulted in very interesting and varied conversations and different viewpoints and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had dinner with JT, our show producer, which I have never met before earlier than this conference, so it was a good opportunity to talk to him. And there were some other folks from IX Systems there, so we had an interesting evening talking.
Mm-hmm. And then the Friday Night Hacker Lounge was so large that we took over a larger room, and it had better Wi-Fi, so, no one complained. And that's where I ran into that stuff with the init and so on. So I ended up being very productive, even though I didn't write any code. So that was good. And then Saturday featured, again, an excellent breakfast and then even more talks. We had The Realities of Dtrace by George Neville Neal, a deep dive into FreeBSD's kernel RNG with John Mark Gurney and Dean Freeman. That one was very interesting to see how some of the bits work there. And then Michael Shirk presented the state of network security tools on BSD. Then we had excellent lunch again. And then Paul Vixie presented making GetHes and its friends more like SIGPipe and SIGIL. In particular, certain dangerous functions in libc and wanting to get rid of those.
Yep.
I would say that, and then the last two talks were Gedley support for UEFI by Eric McCorkle and BSD system management with Ansible by some person I'd never heard of before named Benedict Reichling.
Yeah. strange guy, but I wasn't at the talk. I was somehow occupied with other things. Well, split
Didn't get to watch
personality
that
and
one,
all
eh?
that. Yeah, it was good, I hear.
I'd say the talk I was most interested in was Eric McCorkle's talk about his work on Geli support for UEFI, basically the EFI version of the BIOS Geli boot work I had done. I had reviewed some of the work, although it was mostly not in my area of expertise. But it was interesting to hear the story of how he went through it and the number of times he kind of started over with a different approach and so on, and how much that paralleled my own story of how I had done Geli boot and the amount of, smashing my head against an old X220 that went on there. But I would say my favorite speaker on Saturday was Paul Vixie. He gave a very interesting talk in his very unique style about getS function, which is assigned to get a string, basically. But what's interesting is that getS was responsible for one of the first computer worms, the Morris worm, because it turns out it doesn't check how much data it reads, and it can read too much and then overflow the stack and so on. Mm-hmm. What's interesting is getS was declared unsafe before the FreeBSD project even started. So the original code import of the CSRG source into FreeBSD, it already includes a compile time warning and a runtime warning against using getS. And, in the C99 standard, it was declared deprecated, and actually in C11, it's already been removed. And so there were a number of efforts after Paul's talk to go and clean this up in FreeBSD. One of them was to follow what Paul had put on his slides and make the getS call the abort function, which would cause any program that tries to use it to crash, saying it done something it shouldn't have, or to just remove getS entirely, which would cause the program not to be able to compile or run. Interesting thing that was brought up during the conference is that it turns out Openbsd actually removed getS recently in version 5.6, which actually I guess is a couple of years ago now. But it'll be interesting to see that happen. But also, I do wonder what other kind of historic things are still lurking around in the source code. It's very interesting working with a source base that's so much older than I am.
Yeah, it's scary sometimes, but as long as people are, making progress with new implementations that are more secure, then I'm all for it.
Yep. In the show notes, I see Benedict has added his slides as well.
Yeah, I put them up on my FreeBSD space so people can look at it who don't want to wait for the video or just want to have a quick peek at the slides. And then I guess the vBSDcon folks will put all the recordings up when they're ready.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, and then we had an interesting... So in the registration hall where everyone went and got their T-shirts and all that in the first day, there was a little jar with computer components in them, like... CPU coolers and all kinds of chips and different...
There was quite a few different things in that jar. So basically a big flower vase, and there was, some CPU coolers for like some high-end HP servers or something that had been bent accidentally, and so they were thrown in there. A 486 CPU, like an old modem or something, and a bunch of other components, but also a bunch of small pieces. There's like individual diodes and capacitors and stuff.
Yeah, the people had to guess and write down how many components they think are in that jar. So, and the one who was closest could win a MacBook Pro. It's an entry model.
Yeah, that was donated by CDW, the computer hardware supplier for VeriSign.
And guess who won? Alan Jude won. That was so funny. Because Alan is already carrying 2 ThinkPads to conferences, and now he had to leave with 3 computers in mobile form.
Yeah, definitely didn't expect that. I just made a wild guess. I was like, I'll just pick, one of those magic computery numbers, 384, right? It's like 256 plus 128. And then I was like, somebody else might have the same idea. And it turned out some other people did. So I added 2 to make sure that my number would be slightly closer, hopefully, than theirs. Because I think it was Will Andrews said he had done basically the same thing, but picked 192 instead of 384. So yeah, I didn't think I was anywhere close at all. But I think VeriSign said the number was 396 or something like that. 390 something. So I was definitely the closest, and I think Kurt Little was second closest. But yes, I've never used a Mac before. I've never felt much desire to have a Mac, but I have a Mac now, and I've been playing with it, and then it's like, okay, we'll see what we can do with this.
Yeah, keep us updated on that progress. I guess people will want to see what you are doing with this thing.
At 3 pounds, it is definitely much lighter than my existing laptops. So, should be fine. And then later Saturday night, we had the conference social, which was an excellent dinner and many more great conversations, and much fun was had by all. And then on Sunday morning, a number of us went to the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. So there's a museum downtown, but they obviously can't fit all that much in the museum. So they have a big aircraft hangar out by the airport where they keep all the big stuff, which is exactly what the big group of us were looking for. So we got to see a Concorde. I think it was actually the very first one, an SR-71, and the Space Shuttle Discovery, which is a space shuttle that has made the most trips into outer space.
Yep.
Along with lots of other interesting exhibits.
Yep, and you could see the scratches on the surface, like at the re-entry point where the heat is the biggest, and wow, that was certainly a piece of history there.
Yes, so we'd like to thank VeriSign especially for all their hard work. The conference organization team there did an excellent job. I'm very thankful for them. And then we'd also like to thank everybody who sponsored vBSDcon, including Dell EMC, IX Systems, the FreeBSD Foundation, Damon Security. I don't think I missed anybody. Nope. That was everybody. So thank you very much to those sponsors for making vBSDcon a reality. Yep.
Thank you very much. And we've been talking with the organizers a little bit afterwards, like what went well, what we should repeat, what we should try next time. So next time vBSDcon is in 2019?
Yep.
Year after next? Yep. Okay. And we'll, of course, keep you updated on any updates regarding slides and videos and for the next announcement for vBSDcon.
So next up, we have the story behind a recent errata notice on FreeBSD. So after our previous deep dive on episode 209 into that Solaris networking bug, Christoph Provost, who's the maintainer of PF on FreeBSD, and he's really going to hate me for saying that out loud, wrote up this little blog post. He says, first thing first, so I have to, he says, Alan twisted my arm on episode 209 of BSD Now to write this, so we'll have a little talk about en17:08.pf. First thing first is that I need to point out that I think Alan misremembered things. The heroic debugging story is actually PR219251, and he'll write about that one later. So you'll have to wait for next week to hear the story that I was actually talking about. But we have this story, so we might as well talk about it here as well.
Yeah, so what's this all about? It's a PF bug or an errata?
Yep.
Basically?
It's an errata notice to fix a PF bug.
Okay. And the bug itself manifests in which way?
Right. So it says the errata notice number 8 for 2017 is an issue that affected some FreeBSD 11.x systems where FreeBSD would panic on startup. There were no reports on current, but on the release branch, this was happening. And you see that it was panicking here. And then it says, there's very little to go on here, as we do know the cause of the panic, an integer divide fault, which usually means, trying to divide by 0, and that the current process was pf purge when it happened. The pf purge thread is part of the housekeeping infrastructure. It's a housekeeping kernel thread that cleans up things like old states and expired fragments. So there's a snippet of code here where you can see what it's actually doing. And you say, the lack of mention of any pf functions in the backtrace is a hint unto itself. It suggests that the error is probably directly in the pf purge thread. It might also be in some of the static functions it calls, but your compiler most often inlines those, and so you don't actually see stack frames. Because that is the problem of the integer divide fault, how can integer division be a problem? Well, you can try to divide by 0, which is undefined. The most obvious suspect is this bit of code here, where we see the index is equal to the purge expired states for that index with the hash mask divided by the timeout interval times 10. And so this number could be 0. And if that happens, then you're dividing this other number by 0. However, this variable is both correctly initialized in the pfattach vnet function and can only be modified through the set timeout octal call, and that always checks for 0. At that point, I had no idea what could happen. But because the problem did not affect current, I looked at the commit history and found this recent commit by Luis Souza. It says, do not run the pf purge thread while the vnet variables are not yet initialized. This can cause a divide by 0 if the vnet initialization takes too long to complete. As Christoph says, this sounds very familiar, and indeed, applying the patch fixed the problem. As Louise explained, it's possible to use the vpf default rule.timeout variable before it has been initialized, which could cause the panic. To me, this reaffirms the importance of writing good commit messages. Because Louise mentioned both the pf purge thread and the division by 0, I was able to easily find the relevant commit. If I hadn't found it, this fix could have taken a lot longer to come up with.
Oh yeah, indeed. You had to pretty much go back in history and check every single revision that has been made. That is a lot more work to do.
Or, it could have been a completely unrelated reason why it wasn't happening on current.
There's something special or something that hasn't been encountered before. Yeah, then it starts to get tricky. Then you have to really dig deep into different options of how this could be replicated or triggered in the first place.
This week's episode of BSD Now is brought to you by IX Systems. If you head over to ixsystems.com/BSDnow, you can get their ultimate guide to buying a new server for open source. If you need new hardware, this is definitely the right place to go. Even now, I'm in the middle of dealing with my bestest server that I got from IX, and one of the drives has decided to start misbehaving. And it was, I put in my ticket, and very quickly the replacement drive is on the way. But also I got some extra tips and so on how to better deal with the strange side effects that this drive had. So the drive didn't quite die all the way. It was still working, just taking its time about it and so on. And it was causing some kind of weird side effects on the server. But luckily, IX has all the right experts to provide that extra bit of information and, to tell you how to deal with stuff. They really have the support people that understand, what FreeBSD is or what open source is and what drivers are going to work. And, they're the right people to talk to build your server. Because not only are they going to help you build the server, right, but they provide the support, right? They're not just reselling you the hardware you could get yourself. They're integrating it for you and providing the support that you really can't get anywhere else.
Yeah, because they test the systems thoroughly before they send it to you. And
and just no one else has shipped more FreeBSD production servers. They've seen that many more different use cases and that many more different systems that they know what to look for and where to help you debug the problem and so on. They just have the experience that no other vendor has right now.
Yeah, whether it's a small system like a FreeNAS Mini or a big server platform like a high-density filer that you're building or that you require for your problem.
In particular, this particular system is a 4U with 36 6-terabyte helium drives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can find that on ixsystems.com in the server section, and you can glean at those numbers and what kind of configurations you can build. There's a lot of things you can combine, and you can create a really powerful system that way, depending on your use case.
Yep. So now for some, less pleasant news. We have a blog post by Brian Cantrill on the sudden death and eternal life of Solaris.
Oh yeah, it's a sad story.
Yeah, it says, as has been rumored for a while, Oracle has effectively killed Solaris this a couple of weeks ago on Friday. He says, when I first saw this, I had assumed that this was merely a deep cut. But in talking to Solaris engineers who are still at Oracle, it is clearly much more than that. It was a cut so deep as to be fatal. The core Solaris engineering organization has lost on the order of 90% of its people, including essentially all of the management. Of note, among the engineers I've spoken with, I heard two things repeatedly. That this is the end, and from those who managed to survive the Friday culling, I wish I had been laid off.
Yeah, there's not much sense making this 10% effort of moving on.
Being the skeleton crew trying to keep Solaris alive just to meet contractual obligations doesn't sound like a fun day job. They say, gone is any of the optimism, however tepid, that I had heard over the years. The embarrassed apologies for Oracle's behavior have been replaced with dismay about the clumsiness, ineptitude, and callousness with which this final cut was handled. In particular, that employees who had given their careers to the company were told about their termination via a pre-recorded call, or robo-rift. So rift is reduction in force. It's an old military term for when, after a war, the military doesn't need so many people and they reduce the size of the force. Mm-hmm. So robo-riff is what some of the employees have taken to calling it. And Cantrell says that is both despicable and cowardly. To their credit, the engineers affected saw themselves as being Sun all the way to the end, even though they were still working at Oracle at that point. They stayed to solve hard, interesting problems and out of allegiance to each other, not out of any loyalty to the broader Oracle, but to the Sun people there. Oracle didn't deserve them, and now it doesn't have them. They have been liberated, if in a depraved act of corporate violence.
Yeah, there's nothing more that describes
assuming that this
better.
Is indeed the end of Solaris, as it most certainly looks like it is, it offers a time for reflection. Certainly, the demise of Solaris is at one level not surprising, but on the other hand, its very suddenness highlights the degree to which proprietary software can suffer by the vicissitudes of corporate capriciousness. Now he's just using a bunch of big words in a row. Vulnerable to executive whims, shareholder demands, and the fickle public, organizations can simply change direction by fiat. And because, in the words of the late great Roger Faulkner, it is easier to destroy than to create, these changes in direction can have lasting effects when they mean stopping, or even suspending, work on a project. Indeed, any engineer in any domain with sufficient longevity will have one or more stories of exciting projects being cancelled by foolhardily or myopic management. For software, though, these cancellations can be particularly gutting because, in the proprietary world anyway, so many of the details of software are carefully hidden from the users of the product. And much of the innovation of a canceled software project will likely die with that project, living only in the oral tradition of the engineers who worked on it. Worse, in the long run, to paragraph Keynes, proprietary software projects are all dead. However ubiquitous at their height, this lonely fate awaits all proprietary software. There is, of course, another way, and befitting its idiosyncratic life and death, Solaris shows us this path too. Software can be open source. In stark contrast to proprietary software, open source software cannot even die. Yes, it can be disused or rusty and fusty, but as long as anyone is interested in it at all, it lives and breathes. Even should the interest wane to nothing, open source software survives still. Its life as machines may be suspended, but it becomes as literature waiting to be discovered by a future generation. That is, while proprietary software can die in an instant, open source software perpetually endures by its nature and thrives by the strength of its communities. Just as the existence of proprietary software can be surprisingly brittle, open source communities can be crazily robust. They can survive neglect, derision, dissent, and even sabotage. In this regard, I speak from experience. From when Solaris was open sourced in 2005, the Open Solaris community survived all of these things. By the time Oracle bought Sun 5 years later in 2010, the community had decided it needed true independence, and Illumos was born. And it turns out Illumos was born at exactly the right moment. Shortly after Illumos was announced, Oracle, in what remains to be the singularly loathsome and cowardly act, silently re-proprietized Solaris on August 13, 2010. We in Illumos were indisputably on our own, and while many outsiders gave us no chance of survival, we indeed had reason for confidence. After all, open source communities are robust because they are often united not only by circumstances but by values. And in our case, we, as a community, never lost our belief in ZFS, zones, dtrace, and myriad other technologies like MDB, FMA, and Crossbow. Indeed, since 2010, Illumos has thrived. Illumos is not only the repository of record for technologies that have become cross-platform, like OpenZFS, but we've also advanced our core technologies considerably, while still maintaining the highest standards of quality. Learning from some of the mistakes of Open Solaris, we had a model that allowed for downstream innovation, experimentation, and differentiation. For example, Joyent's SmartOS has always been focused on our need for a cloud hypervisor, which caused us to develop big features like hardware virtualization and the Linux binary compatibility layer. It is now at the heart of a massive build-out for Samsung, which acquired Joyent about a year ago. For us at Joyent, the Solaris Illumos SmartOS saga has been formative in that we have been seen both the ill effects of proprietary software and the amazing resilience of open source software and communities. And it has very much informed our decision to open source our entire stack back in 2014. Judging merely by its tombstone, the life of Solaris can be viewed as tragic. Born out of wedlock between Sun and AT&T, and dying at the hands of a remorseless corporate sociopath a quarter century later. And even when that may be overstated as longevity, Solaris may not have been truly born until it was made open source. And certainly to me anyway, it died the moment it again became proprietary. But in that short life, Solaris achieved the singularity, immortality for its revolutionary technologies. So while we can mourn the loss of the proprietary embodiment of Solaris, we can certainly lament the coarse way in which the technology was treated. We can rejoice in the eternal life of these technologies in the Illumos and beyond.
Wow, what a eulogy. There's certainly a lot of things in there that Oracle hasn't done right, and that the Solaris folks had to endure after the takeover. And there are a couple of comments in the response section of that article. Mm-hmm. It remains to be seen what those people are doing that are now looking for jobs, but I guess they are in a good position with all the Solaris knowledge to find new employment.
Yes, I have a note about it later in the roundup section, but IX is looking to hire kernel hackers and ZFS developers and so on. So, if you have a lot of Solaris development experience, we can definitely find a place for you. FreeBSD would love to have
you. So after this rather dramatic demise of Solaris and some of the rejoicing of other people who might not be so happy about it. We'll see how this goes. But now it's time for a news roundup this week. Something more practical, because OpenBSD on the Lenovo ThinkPad X1 Carbon 5th generation. So Joshua Stein has written up a blog post about his experience with that ThinkPad. So he writes, ThinkPads have a sort of a cult following among OpenBSD developers and users because the hardware is basic and well supported. And the keyboards are great to type on. While no stranger to ThinkPads myself, most of my OpenBSD laptops in recent years have been from various vendors with brand new hardware components that OpenBSD does not yet support. As satisfying as it is to write new kernel drivers or extend existing ones to make the hardware work, it usually leaves me with a laptop that doesn't work very well for periods of a month. After exhausting efforts trying to debug the I2C touchpad interrupts in the Huawei MateBook X, I think we covered this in an earlier episode, he decided to take a break and use something with better OpenBSD support out of the box, the 5th generation Lenovo ThinkPad X1 Carbon. This is actually his second 5th generation X1, as he bought one back in February when they were initially available, but it arrived with a broken touchpad. So he sent it back to Lenovo for repairs, waited a month for replacement parts, but gave up waiting and got a refund. It was probably the best since those early models only came with an FHD display, but not a WQHD display is available. So this is the current status here. And so it starts off with hardware. For those who have never seen this ThinkPad or don't know what the actual hardware in this thing is. Like most ThinkPads, the X1 Carbon is available in a myriad of different internal configurations. He went with the non-vPro Core i7-7500U, and it was the same price as the Core i5 that is normally his choice. 16 gigabytes of RAM, 256 gigabytes of NVMe SSD, and a WQHD display. This generation of X1 Carbon finally brings a thinner screen bezel, allowing the entire footprint on the laptop to be smaller, since this is welcome on something with a 14-inch screen. The X1 now measures 12.7 inch wide, 8.5 inch deep, and 0.6 inch thick, and weighs just 2.6 pounds.
That's lighter than my MacBook.
Yeah, now you have a better comparison. You can hold them in both hands and measure them. While not available at initial launch, Lenovo is now offering a WQHD IPS screen option, giving a resolution of 2560 by 1440. Perhaps more importantly, this display also has much better brightness than the FHD version, something ThinkPads have always struggled with. So on the left side of the laptop, there are two USB-C ports, a USB-A port, and a full-size HDMI port, as well as a port for the Ethernet dongle, which, despite some reviews stating otherwise, is not included with the laptop. On the right side is another USB-A port and a headphone jack, along with a fan exhaust grill. On the back is a tray for the micro SIM card for the optional WWAN device, which also covers the Realtek micro SD card reader. And the tray requires a paper clip to eject, which makes it inconvenient to remove. So I think this micro SD card slot is designed to house a card semi-permanently as a backup disk or something. And on the bottom, there are two speakers towards the front and an exhaust grill near the center. The four rubber feet are rather plastic feeling, which allows the laptop to slide around on the desk a bit too much for his liking, and he wishes that they were a bit softer and to be stickier. So charging. This can be done via either the two USB-C ports on the left, though he wishes more vendors would do as Google did on the Chromebook Pixel, and provide a port at least on both sides, so you can plug in one way or the other.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is something people are, depending on where their power source is, I want to stick the cable on the right side or on the left side.
Yeah, that's why I've kind of been happy with, on my ThinkPad, it's all on the back, because that's kind of center-ish-y, but being able to plug into a USB-C port and putting one on each side would be super handy, yeah.
Yep. Okay, yeah. Besides that, the X1 Carbon includes a 65 watts USB-C PD with a fixed USB-C cable and removable country-specific power cable, which is not very convenient due to its large footprint. So he's using an Apple 61 watt USB-C charger and an anchor cable which charges the X1 fine, unlike the HP laptops which only work with HP USB-C chargers. Yeah, the vendors sometimes make it sure that they lock you in by their power cables. Apple isn't better in this regard.
It goes on to say the wireless is provided by an Intel 8265, which does ABGN and AC, and Bluetooth 4.1. The wired networking is an Intel i219-V, although it requires an external dongle for the physical connector. So the controller is built in, but because the bezel's so thin, they didn't have room for the actual Ethernet connector, the RJ45. It says the screen hinges are rather tight, which makes it difficult to open with one hand, but the trade-off is that it doesn't wobble when you're typing. The fan is silent at idle, and there's no coil whine under heavy load. Even doing make -J4, the fan noise is reasonable and medium pitched rather than high pitched like you get with some really whiny laptops. And the palm rest and keyboard area remain cool even when the CPU gets hot, and nothing worse than a laptop that gets too hot to touch.
Yeah, while you're running a build world or something.
Yep.
Yeah, he continues.
The full-size keyboard is backlit and offers 2 levels of adjustment. The keys have a soft surface and somewhat clicky feel, providing very quiet typing, except for certain keys like Enter and Backspace and Escape. The keyboard has a key travel of 1.5 millimeters, and there's a dedicated page up and page down keys. I really missed that on the MacBook right away. Was no page up or page down.
Yeah, you have the FN key for that. You have a modifier with
I think it was
multiple.
The Apple key page down or something like that. Yeah.
You'll get used to it. Anyway, the function key is or the FN key is placed on the left of control, which some people hate. Although Lenovo does provide a BIOS option to swap that, but it's in the same position on Apple keyboards, so I'm used to it. However, since there are dedicated page up, page down, home, and end keys, I don't really have a use for the function keys anyway. Then there's a dedicated power button above the function now, and its green LED remains illuminated while powered on, which is slightly annoying. And of course, the Synaptics touchpad surface is soft, but its integrated button has a solid, firm, and quiet click, while I like that very much. There is no play in the touchpad button like on some other cheaper laptops. The 3 track point buttons between the keyboard and touchpad have a shallow click. Both pointer interfaces have a legacy PS2 attachment, and a square USB-attached fingerprint sensor sits next to the touchpad. There's a Lenovo and X1 Carbon branding on the bottom of the screen bezel, along with a ThinkPad logo on the bottom right of the palm rest. A ThinkPad logo in the upper left corner of the rear of the screen has a red LED which is illuminated when the laptop is on. I've covered the screen branding and power button LED with black tape because I find them distracting. Yeah, there the modification starts. But there's more you can do. In the firmware section, he writes, the X1 Carbon has a very detailed BIOS firmware menu which can be entered with the F1 key at boot. F12 can be used to temporarily select a different boot device, so this is relatively common. A neat feature of the Lenovo BIOS is that it supports showing a custom boot logo instead of the big red Lenovo logo. So from Windows, you download the latest BIOS update utility for the X1 Carbon and run it and extract everything to some random string location on a disk and drop a logo.gif file in the directory and one winuptp.exe. And if a logo file is present, it'll ask whether to use it and then write the new BIOS to its staging area, then reboot to actually flash it. And if you're flashing the same BIOS version, you'll first have to disable, of course, the secure rollback prevention security mechanism in the BIOS, otherwise it will prevent you from doing that. But then with the option key display, setting display disabled in BIOS and a small boot image, the boot screen is much cleaner. And we have a screenshot here with Puffy in the center of the laptop screen.
And
which
so
is
when you
nice.
turn off the option key display, it doesn't print, press F1 to do this and F12 to do that and so on. And so you get just the logo, which is a very Mac-like experience, actually.
Yeah, this is the customizations people want to do in their laptop to make it more personal to their own liking. Okay, now for the actual OpenBSD support. Secure boot has to be disabled in the BIOS menu, and the CSM support option must be enabled even when UEFI/legacy boot is left on UEFI only. Otherwise, the screen will just go black after the OpenBSD kernel loads into memory. And the status he reports is relative to his OpenBSD source tree as of the 5th of September 2017. So he has a little table here with various components and whether they work or not. Most of them works yes, but there is one component, two actually, Bluetooth. This shows up as UGEN device, but OpenBSD does not support Bluetooth and can be disabled in the BIOS. And the other one is the fingerprint sensor. The Synaptics via USB is not supported and can be disabled in the BIOS as well. The rest, audio, battery status, backlight, keyboard, hibernation, suspend and resume, all work fine. Touchpad, all the wireless, even the webcam is supported. So there's a lot of stuff that you can already do with this device right out of the box in the latest OpenBSD source tree.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty cool.
Another interesting bit of hardware to look at from Lenovo. I know Chris Moore and a lot of the people working on TrueOS are big fans of the X1 Carbon. I think they were on the 3rd generation back last time I talked to them, but it definitely seems like it's if you want something thinner and lighter than an X270 or a T470, it definitely looks interesting. Although stay tuned, we'll soon have more news about the ThinkPad 25, the 25th anniversary retro edition ThinkPad, which is apparently going to bring back the old keyboard from like an X220, but with modern hardware.
Okay. Yeah, and people might look at these ports or these drivers that they have and maybe port them to other BSD systems so that they can use those devices there as well.
Indeed. Next up, we have a story from an unlikely source, linuxsecrets.com. But this is a fairly quick tutorial to get you started with creating a FreeBSD desktop. Right?
Oh, so 5 in total.
This shows how easy it is to install 5 different desktop environments on FreeBSD. So if you're coming from Linux, and depending on which version of Linux you were using before, you're used to a certain desktop environment instead of another. Unlike your average Linux distro that pretty much locks you into one particular desktop environment, on FreeBSD, this guide shows just how easy it is to use whichever one you want.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of desktop environments to play around with.
Yeah, so it starts off with a basic introduction, what is FreeBSD and what is X and so on. But in general, it's quite easy to do this. So they create a user and do some of the basic setup. But then when it comes time to actually install your desktop environment, it's actually quite straightforward. So the 5 desktop environments they picked were GNOME, which I think will be 3, KDE, which I think will be 4, Mate, which is your GNOME 2 derivative, and Cinnamon. Oh, and XFCE. Sorry, I scrolled past that one. So basically, each of these tutorials, this particular part of it for installing the desktop manager, is quite straightforward with a slight variation. You'll have package install GNOME 3 or KDE 4 or XFCE or whichever desktop environment you want. And then or you can build it from source if you're a crazy person. And then, like we had mentioned before, we'd like to see people use sysrc for modifying rc.conf, and they've done that. So they run sysrc and enable dbus and haldi, which are provide the messaging system and the hardware abstraction layer. And then they enable GDM, which is the GNOME desktop manager, and GNOME itself. And so when the system boots up, it will start GDM, which is basically your login screen program that will let you type in your username and password and start GNOME. And if you want to use a different desktop environment, it's the relatively simple process of, say, doing package install KDE 4 and then sysrc enabling dbus and haldi, but instead of GDM, you enable KDM4. And that will start the KDE desktop manager, and you'll get a KDE login screen. Or if you're using something like XFCE, then or Mate that doesn't have a login manager, then you install and enable Slim, which is a Slim login manager. And then in your .xinit.rc, you put execute mate session or execute cinnamon or XFCE, and it will start that desktop environment instead. Depending on the login manager, I know the one for PCBSD or TrueOS, PCDM, actually lets you pick which desktop manager you want to start when you log in. So that's a handy way to actually be able to switch between these or use different ones. If the computer is shared, like some of the ones in our office are, we have multiple users and they get to pick whatever one they want. And then the rest of the tutorial goes through doing some other various tweaking you might want to do, setting up, policy kit rules and tuning things so that a non-root user can mount a USB stick and all the minor little fiddly stuff. But all the basics are right there. And then you can see just how easy it is. And so I added to the end of this in the show notes my own little tutorial on how I set up my Lenovo's when I get them. I basically package install Lumina and PCBSD utils-qt5, which provides PCDM, the login manager, and also the nice Wi-Fi manager from TrueOS. So that installs them, and then I just need to do sysrc pcdm_enable equals yes, and also add dbus and haldy. And then when I reboot, I will be presented by the PCBSD login manager, which will allow me to enter my username and password, but also select that I would like to start Lumina or KDE or XFCE or whatever desktop environment I feel like using that day.
Very nice.
And based on top secret information I got at vBSDcon, shortly some of those will be broken into separate packages, partly to make them easier to find when you're using vanilla FreeBSD. Obviously, when you're using TrueOS, these are already installed for you and you don't have to think about it. But if you're like me and you want your development laptop running FreeBSD head, but you want to still use Lumina, being able to just package install Lumina and like Lumina login manager or Lumina Wi-Fi will make it easier to get those utilities. It'll be a little more obvious where to find those, and they're going to keep them more up to date too, which will be good.
Excellent. Yeah. So FreeBSD people can run the TrueOS stuff on their own machines.
Yes, in particular, Lumina, I've been pretty taken with it. I very much like the lightweight desktop environment, but still has a bit of a Windowsy feel for, the fact that I'm, I still have to use Windows on a regular basis, and I'm been doing it for, almost 20 years now. So I'm very used to the button you use to do stuff being in the bottom corner and so on, and the minimize and close buttons being in a certain place, and then Mac goes and puts everything in the opposite place, and yeah. There's that.
Yeah, but it's something it's a rather smoother transition if you're coming from Windows onto Unix, if you can run a similar looking desktop environment. Yeah, so check those out and enjoy your desktop environment.
Our other big sponsor this week is DigitalOcean. If you go to digitalocean.com, you can spin up FreeBSD or other OS instances in the cloud in under 55 seconds and for as little as $5 a month, or 0.7 of a cent per hour.
Mine's been running for over a month now, and it's just great. It just runs. It doesn't have any hiccups. It just works and provides me all the services that I'm running on that virtual machine.
Yes. So he has a quasar core finally, and he actually stays on IRC for more than 20 minutes at a time, so it's actually possible to leave him a message, which is glorious. Thank you very much to DigitalOcean for making it easy enough that I can just make Benedict do it.
Yeah, you can send me a message 24/7. Yeah, thanks to the DigitalOcean folks, if only that. If you are having a little bit more complicated use case or a little bit more complicated product to install, then you can use the prepackaged applications that they provide for you. Like if you want to set up a blog or some ticketing system or MongoDB, for example, then you can use the prepackaged distros that DigitalOcean provides for you. Another thing that they have is nice monitoring, so you can see some nice graphs like how much CPU or network load you're generating in your virtual machine. You can create a little private networking or set up a little firewall for your virtual machine so it's protected. And DigitalOcean makes it very nice and easy with their GUI programs, or their web GUI programs, I should say, to make it all easy even for newcomers into the cloud world.
Yep, you can also rent storage by the gigabyte quite cheaply, as little as 10 cents per gigabyte per month, which makes it super easy to store as much data as you need to store, and you can always expand the volume later up to 16 terabytes. So
that's a
great
lot.
Way to be able to store stuff online.
Oh.
Plus, with their load balancer and floating IP feature, you can have a static IP that you can move between separate instances so that you can do high availability or just make upgrades easier.
Or testing in production, so you
exactly.
can easily make sure that you try things out first before you put them into the world.
Yep. But yes, head over there, and when you sign up, make sure you use the coupon code FreeBSD Now, and that'll add an extra $10 in credit to your account so that you can have your second and third month free. So our next story also comes from a slightly unlikely source. This is over at the linuxweeklynews.net, or LWN. So I think it was last episode, although for me that was 3 weeks ago. We talked a bit about RetGuard, which is a feature that Theo de Rat announced on the Openbsd mailing list. That provided a lot of the technical detail, but this article provides a much nicer explanation of how it works, so that someone that doesn't understand all the assembly like me can understand it.
Okay, it's so titled there. Yeah.
And it also kind of ties into Paul Vixie's talk a little bit, and the stuff we were talking about with GetS. So stack smashing attacks have a long history. They featured, for example, as a core part of the Morris worm back in 1988. Restrictions on executing code on the stack have, to a great extent, put an end to such simple attacks. But that does not mean that stack smashing attacks are no longer a threat. Return-oriented programming, or ROP, has become a common technique for compromising systems via a stack smashing vulnerability. These are various schemes out there for defending against ROP attacks, but a mechanism called RetGuard that has been implemented in OpenBSD is notable for its relative simplicity. In a classic stack smashing attack, the attack code would be written directly to the stack and then executed there. Most modern systems do not allow execution of on-stack code, though. So this kind of attack would be ineffective. The stack does affect code execution, though, in that the call chain is stored there, where a function executes a return instruction. The address that it ends up returning to is taken from the stack. An attacker who can overwrite the stack can thus force a function to return to some other location. So when the code calls a function, it also notes that when you're done doing all the code for this function, you want to jump back to over here where you were running before. But if you overwrite that with a different address, you can cause it to jump in the middle of some other code and do something else instead. That alone can be enough to carry out some types of attack, but ROP adds another level of sophistication. A search through a body of binary code will turn up a great many short sequences of instructions ending in a return instruction. These sequences are termed gadgets. I've spoken about ROP gadgets a number of times on TechSnap and so on. A large program contains enough gadgets to carry out almost any desired task, if they can be strung together into a chain. ROP works by locating these gadgets, then building a series of stack frames so that each gadget returns into the next one. So you cause this bit of code to run and then jump to this bit of code, this bit of code runs and then jump to this bit and then over here and then back here and up and down and all over, crisscrossing the source tree to execute the various bits of code that you want to run. There is, of course, a significant limitation here. A ROP chain made up exclusively of polymorphic gadgets will still work, since these gadgets were not intentionally created by the compiler and do not contain the return address mangling code. So the way that retguard works is by doing an exclusive or XOR operation on the return address, basically encrypting it with a very basic algorithm of just XORing it with a key, so that it points to a bunch of nonsense. And then only when it's used correctly does the same XOR get applied a second time, undoing it, and you get the real return address. Mm-hmm. So Theo says, so he acknowledged this limitation of retguard, that polymorphic code can still work, but he said, we believe once standard ret is solved, these concerns become easier to address separately in the future. In any case, a substantial reduction in the number of gadgets is still very powerful. Using the compiler to insert the hardening code greatly eases the task of applying retguard. Right? You don't have to add this to every function, you just have the compiler do it. And this way, both the Openbsd kernel and its userland can have retguard applied. At least this is true of code written in higher level languages. Calling C a higher level language is kind of interesting there. Any code written in assembly, however, must be changed by hand, though a fair amount of work to do. The RAT and the rest of the Openbsd developers have done this work, and it reports that we're at the point where userland and base are fully working without any regressions, and the remaining impacts are in a few larger ports which directly access the return address for a variety of different reasons. It can be expected that once these final issues are dealt with, Openbsd will actually enable this by default. Mm-hmm. The article wonders about applying the same to Linux, but notes that this could be difficult because the Linux kernel cannot actually be compiled with LLVM at this point, which is where Openbsd added this, the compiler changes. If any benchmarks have been run to determine the cost of using retguard, they have not been posted publicly yet. The extra code will make the kernel a bit bigger, and the extra overhead on every function is likely to add up in the end, but if this technique can make the kernel that is much harder to exploit, it may well justify the extra execution overhead that it brings with it. All that needs is someone to actually work out, what that overhead actually is. Mm. But there's even more detail in the article talking about how the actually works with obj-tool and so on, and how they foresee it maybe working on Linux.
Yeah, would be something nice to have. Mm. Oh, and finally, our next stories. People have been waiting for this. Videos from BSDcon 2017 have been started to appear on YouTube.
Yep, not all of them are there yet, but they are slowly leaking out. I imagine Dan's pretty busy. I know he's not back at home yet, and then he'll be going to BSDcon. So I don't know how many more you'll see by time you actually see this episode, because it'll be another week or two from when I record this before you actually see it. But so maybe there'll be more videos by then, or maybe not. But shortly after, I would expect more videos to start coming out. Mm. But we have quite a few hours of content for you here to begin with. So, you're not going to be starved for content.
Oh, yeah. If you watch all those, then you'll pretty much have a good understanding of what we talked about there and what kind of tracks there were. Yeah. Or if you have been to another track and wanted to see the one in the parallel room, then you have a good chance to get those and see them after the fact.
Yeah, there are at least 2 or 3 that meet that criteria for me, even if just the ones that I've posted so far. One of them, I've seen a different speaker give a somewhat similar talk, because two people working on the same project. But, there's always value in seeing the other bits and being able to rewind and so on. But so far, we have Henning Bauer's talk on TCP SYN floods and how to deal with them in PF. Benno Rice's The Trouble with FreeBSD, which is talking about the community and how the uniqueness of our community presents different challenges than a lot of other communities have. Li Wen talking about continuous integration in the FreeBSD project and his similar. Andrew Turner talking about creating a generic kernel for ARM so that we don't have to have a special one-off kernel for every single little single-board computer that comes out. Bjorn Zeeb from the outside is talk about using the Gem 5 simulator to look for bugs in FreeBSD from the CPU's perspective rather than from the code perspective. Rod Grimes talking about FreeBSD as a service. Rick Fleuter talking about Openbsd's virtual machine daemon, or VMM, their answer to Beehive. And Brian Kidney talking about the realities of gtrace on FreeBSD.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. And I would expect more of the videos to start trickling out. And then we'll have more things to watch.
Yeah,
As
for
if
those
I have time
cold,
for that.
Yeah, there will be cold days and without much interaction or much you can do outside. So you sit in your room, get a cup of coffee and watch those videos or whatever drink you prefer.
Yes, I guess in my case, I might actually manage to go the entire month of December without going anywhere. And so I can try to catch up on the conference stuff I missed.
For a change. Yeah. Do you have something in January already?
Maybe not, but was it the first week of February is FOSDEM already, right?
Yeah, it starts relatively early in the year again.
I think February is also going to be the storage summit.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Connected to
It's busy.
Yeah, we have a list of call for papers that are open at the end of the show. I think we're going to try to keep that as a segment and remind you every week to submit your talks.
Yeah.
In particular, we would like to have more FreeBSD talks at non-FreeBSD conferences. We want to parachute people in and
Yeah, get the word out about the work we're doing or you're doing.
Exactly. And, brainwash more people.
One after the other. Slowly but steadily.
Us.
Time for our Beastie Bits this week. We have another interesting entry about Oracle has killed Sun, and it's a longer entry, but...
Yeah, there's a whole thing here, and I recommend reading it, but their bulleted list of what happened to all the Sun technologies is disheartening. Java was described as the crown jewel of Sun, but with the real reason to buy Java SE and so on, it turned out for Oracle was to sue Google for $8 billion, but that failed twice. Allison said Java's role in middleware was the key to its success, but Java Enterprise Edition is now going off to its own foundation. Oracle criticized Sun for failing to monetize Java, ignoring the fact that Java made the market, which Sun monetized with hardware for a number of years, and proposed a freemium model that has not resulted in any revenue. They embraced NetBeans, which is now donated to Apache, a good thing, but not an Oracle outcome, really. The bureaucracy over MySQL security fixes led to a decent portion of the user community to move over to MariaDB. Ellison said he would rebuild Sun's hardware business, but its bosses quit a month ago, and the team is part of the ones being laid off, so no hardware coming out there. Despite McNeely's understanding that Solaris had to be open to win the market, Oracle hyped it up and then closed it down. The result of this week's layoffs means that there's probably not much support going there. The mishandling of the Hudson CI system is why we now have Jenkins instead. Oracle's abandoned Sun's identity management projects and now ForgeRock uses them in a business valued around $500 million. Instead, Oracle decided to cancel Sun's Cloud and dismantled the ready-for-cloud features of Solaris, and then decided that they needed a cloud and had to do that. Oracle renamed Star Office and announced a cloud version, but couldn't make it fly. Seemingly the impending EOL of the project and alienated by heavy-handed treatment caused everybody to jump over to LibreOffice. And it seems that the only technology from Sun that Oracle hasn't managed to burn to the ground or give away was VirtualBox.
Yeah, I hear that they still have most of the original VirtualBox team around from when they acquired it from, I think it was a German company, Innotech something. And we'll see how that goes. I mean, they publish regular updates, and there are some improvements
they seem not
here and
very
there.
regular for a while, but yeah. Hopefully.
Well, yeah.
Next, we have a quick, useful tutorial. This is how to configure Thunderbird to send patches friendly. So it shows an example of trying to send a patch using Outlook or Gmail and watching it get mangled. So they show how to configure Thunderbird to send a patch in a way that even the Openbsd hackers will be happy with. So first, disabling the HTML format in your sending. In your config editor, disabling the send plaintext reflowed option and so on. And now when you send your patch, it will look correct. So just a couple of minor tweaks to the configuration, and Thunderbird will keep everybody happy.
And do the right thing. Okay. Oh, speaking of doing the right thing, FreeBSD 10.4 Beta 4 is available. And we talked at the
I imagine
vBSDcon.
By the time you're seeing this, RC1 or 2 will be out, so you really need to hurry up and do the testing.
Yeah, we talked at vBSDcon Dev Summit since Glenn Barber, our release engineer, gave a talk, and we're pretty much in agreement with the rest of the room that people should try and test out the beta releases and the RC candidates to find bugs early so we can fix them in the release when it comes out and not afterwards. So the noteworthy changes since 10.4 Beta 3 are that an erroneous implementation of a silicon bug workaround caused the EM driver to always silently disable support for VLAN hardware TSO and TSO4 on the first time an interface was configured. So that has been fixed. There's a little longer description here. The IGB driver now handles received packets whose ether type protocols are unsupported or for which support has not been compiled in gracefully instead of triggering a panic. A crash of date that could be triggered by passing invalid time has been corrected. The file utility received a fix for CVE 2017-1249, and a bug of IP filter preventing nutted MTU discovery to work has been addressed. Mellanox Connect X-4 series adapters are now supported actually by the newly added MLX5IB driver. And OpenSSH received an update to version 7.3 patch level 1.
Nice. Then, as we alluded to earlier, there's a job posting from IX Systems here saying, "Attention, please. Dear Sun/Oracle refugees, are you seeking asylum? IX Systems, the company behind the freelance community, is looking for people who are passionate about Unix and ZFS. We're storage/systems engineers, kernel developers, file system engineers, sales engineers, performance engineers, and so on. So please get in touch with hr@ixsystems.com if you want to keep working on Unix and kernels and ZFS and file systems and so on."
And IX System is a nice company that, as far as I hear their employees talk, they provide very good for their employees and have regular like parties and little gadgets here and there. So this is a nice working environment. Speaking of jobs, we always get the question, where I can find like job posting that include BSD. I want to work with BSD related companies. So we have something here that's called United BSD. And those have a couple of job postings from time to time where they find something on the web or post them directly for like positions in the first one I have here. It's the one about network migration engineer that's looking in the Dublin area to work with OpenBSD networking engineering. So if you're interested in that, check this out. And there are other postings. So in this. So come back regularly if you're looking for a job in the BSD area, and maybe you can find something through this website.
So the other section we were talking about earlier was the call for papers. So Usenix FAST, which is the File Systems and Storage Technology Conference, 2018 will be held February 12th through 15th. But the deadline for paper submissions is September 28th, so you don't have much time. So get that in. They also do tutorials there, so if you want to give a tutorial, you can submit that. And you'll be notified by December 11th, and the final version of your paper will be due January 23rd.
Mm-hmm.
There's also Scale, the Southern California
Linux event,
Linux
something. Expo, yeah.
They're looking for, specifically, they have tracks on open source in the enterprise, containers and virtualization, open data, open source storage, securities, developers, cloud, next generation, legal and licensing, mentoring, and embedded. So even certain non-technical topics are definitely of interest to them. The call for papers opened back August 15th, and the deadline for abstracts and proposals is October 31st. And then you will be notified before November 30th, and the conference is on March 8th through 11th. And then finally, the other one we have here so far is FOSDEM, the Free Open Source Developers European Meeting, which I've been to the last 2 years, and it has been quite interesting. That will run February 3rd and 4th, but you should get your papers in by their first deadline, which is October 13th. But if they don't get enough talks, they will continue to accept submissions until November 3rd. So try to get it in before the 13th, but if not, go to the 3rd. Also, separately, there will be organized a FreeBSD dev room, which if your talk does not get accepted to the main conference, it has the option of being in the BSD dev room. So submit to both.
Yeah, you will increase your chances of being accepted. All right, before we go into our feedback and questions section, it's time for our sponsor for this section, which is Tarsnap, the online backups for truly paranoid. So if you've ever thought about backupping into the cloud because you want to have backups secured and stored away where only you can retrieve them, have a look at Tarsnap, because Tarsnap makes it so easy to use, because when you know tar and how to use it, then you're actually quite familiar with Tarsnap already. It helps you create personal keys that never leave your computer, and Tarsnap, the actual backup service, makes sure that the key management works, and you also copy over the encrypted files that are locally on your disk into the cloud, so the cloud will only see your encrypted stuff and will not be able to unencrypt the files without your personal keys, which you never give out of hand. And Tarsnap has a couple of GUIs available for or actual user interfaces, let's say, for the Linuxes of this world, the BSDs, macOS, and the Windows subsystem for Linux as well.
Yeah, so you can use it on pretty much any computer, and it's really easy to use, and there's a graphical interface if you're afraid of the command line, so you have absolutely no excuse not to be doing your backups already. So if you haven't, you should be ashamed of yourself and run along and go do backups.
Yep.
So let's get to the questions quick.
Mm-hmm. The first one is from Jason. He asks about a cheap router hardware. So he writes, "Hi Alan, you might already know this, but there's a lot of cheap router hardware available on Alibaba and Amazon. Specifically, I want your opinion on the J1900 quad-core Intel Quad NIC barebone to run a proper pfSense firewall with VPN. The internet speed is about 200 megabits per second, and an open VPN connection that will at least put 100 megabits per second through would be great." So he has 2 links on Amazon here. Have you had a chance to look at those?
I'm not familiar with that CPU exactly, but if you go to GitHub and search for NetBenches, there's a bunch of benchmarks of FreeBSD running on various hardware, including some of the lower-end atoms like that. In general, I would expect you to be able to do 250 megabits without breaking a sweat on anything that has an actual atom and isn't really low power.
Yep. This would be...
Beyond that, I don't know. My router's awfully big. It's an E3 1220 low voltage.
Yeah, maybe someone else from our readers or listeners.
If people in the audience have bought some of these and know how fast they're able to go, we'd very much be interested in knowing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll connect you too if you have something found out. Next up is Prashant, and he asks about latest kernels with FreeBSD update. So he starts, greetings everyone. I started following BSD Now since the first episode. I remember back that Alan and Chris used to co-host BSD Now. I remember interacting with TJ in relation to some technical issues a couple of years ago on 11 current series regarding state of GNOME 3 desktop that he was facing. He's inspired by our team. He respects us a lot. Well, thank you. I have been back and forth between TrueOS and FreeBSD on an experimental basis. Arch Linux has been my primary OS, but when Arch stopped supporting 32 bits installs, I took a leap of faith and wiped out Linux completely from all my old hardware and did a fresh install of FreeBSD. During this journey, I have frequently visited numerous tutorials from BSD Now shows. The journey has been very rewarding and transition was smooth due to excellent documentation from the FreeBSD handbook. Thank you. BSD Now tutorials, as well as the Arch Wiki, which is quite relevant and useful even for FreeBSD for common utilities. He generally wants to thank us for our great show. You not only inspired him, or not us, we not only inspired him to learn new skills, but also made the journey smooth. He hopes to contribute back, hopefully with code patches someday. Well, why not? I have been a developer for most part of my professional career, so if I stretch a bit, this is possible. These days, by default, he tries to boot into FreeBSD and loses Linux less and less often. He's on FreeBSD 12 current, and as he came from Arch, he likes to get his fingers dirty with the latest and the greatest. It breaks a few things, but it also allows him to learn more. In this regard, he noticed that he normally stays stuck with the version of FreeBSD kernel which came at the time of installation. He writes, I tried a few ways, and the only thing that works for me currently is compiling from sources or fresh install, which both are really time-consuming. The question is, how do I get the latest version of FreeBSD kernel while I'm on 12 current branch? I don't want to compile from source or reinstall the OS. Could you please point me to a tutorial for this? If one doesn't exist, there is one idea for you for an upcoming BSD Now episode. And last but not least, thank you so much. Please keep up the good work, and looking forward to great shows ahead.
Yes, thank you for the kind words. This is most of the reason why we're trying to build packaged base, because it solves this problem. So if you're using TrueOS, this is already built in. There are packages, including one called FreeBSD-kernel-generic or something. And when you package upgrade, it will download the newer one and install it. And all you have to do is run package upgrade on the base repo. So that's probably what I recommend for now. And we'll hopefully have that in FreeBSD soon. And thank you for TrueOS for testing that on their unsuspecting users.
Yeah, it's a recurring topic at Dev Summits, and we want to get
so
package
to try to move this forward, we discussed in the working group on package base at vBSDcon about trying to get some repos up so that people can use this on vanilla FreeBSD. Currently, you can build the new version and then install it as a package instead of just make install kernel, but that's not really saving you any time. Probably taking slightly more. But. So yes, using TrueOS packages on their, what do they call it, their unstable repo will give you frequent updates to the OS that way.
Yep. And it's good to see that you made a great journey or a transition which was not very bumpy, which is good to hear for some of our readers who might, or listeners who might consider the same thing. Yeah, good stuff. Next up is Matt, and he wants to know about VM performance and CPU steal time. He writes, hi, Alan and Benedict. Love the show. Thanks for continuing to put it on every week. Yeah. He had a quick question about FreeBSD virtualization that he was hoping we have a tiny bit of insight into. So up until recently, all of his FreeBSD deployments were almost entirely physical hardware, although he has been spinning up more VMs lately across a couple of cloud providers such as AWS, Google Cloud Platform, and DigitalOcean. For web servers especially, one of my common routines is to run a synthetic benchmark like Apache Bench against Nginx serving static pages to get a relative feel for performance versus other cloud instance. So he has the invocation provided here in the notes. For some reason, even when testing against localhost, FreeBSD's %user and %sys CPU time seems extremely lopsided compared to the same size with CentOS and Ubuntu VMs. Whereas Linux is almost entirely %user CPU time and low %sys, less than 10%, FreeBSD sys tends to be far higher in these tests, 50% or more, even outpacing the %user CPU time for the duration of the operation. This seems to be consistent whether Apache Bench is being run locally against localhost or from another virtual machine over the private network stack. He also notices during his most recent round of testing that FreeBSD doesn't appear to report CPU steal time in any of the base utilities that I thought to try, nor did it appear to be present using HTOP or ATOP either. So his questions for us are, do we have any idea as to why FreeBSD's 11.1 release VM guest performance would at passing glance seem to be so off compared to some same-sized Linux instances when it comes to user or sys time performing the same operation, such as inefficiencies remaining in virtualization code needing to be ironed out, interrupt scheduling, etc.
Before your next part, that can depend on a bunch of things. I don't know if Apache Bench is using epoll for Linux and something else for FreeBSD or something that could cause that. Also, what's the actual runtime? Is FreeBSD actually being slower, or is it just accounting for the time more under system than under user, and it could just be what counts as what? But it'd be an interesting thing to investigate, but I don't know the answer.
You could check out Brendan Gregg's website, which we're going to meet next week, actually, at EuroBSDcon. He has a couple of documents about CPU analysis and measuring correctly. So this might be something you want to check out before going any further, because you're using, so one benchmark for every different system is good, but maybe that benchmark is only measuring a certain specific things, in this case, maybe, or certainly the Apache or web server performance. But it seems like it's biased towards Linux. So I would try out a different utility just to either confirm your findings or get different ones. So this might be an indicator where things go wrong.
Yeah.
And yeah, his second question is Steele's CPU time reporting something that might be worked on for a future release? He knows many companies with heavy cloud deployments like Netflix rely on metrics like %steal to determine if they're on too noisy or too noisy of a physical host and need to perform a guest termination and migration to gain node performance, and seems like a desired feature to have all around.
Yeah, I don't know that anybody's specifically working on that, but it's definitely something we'd like to have. I will remember to bring that up for the EuroBSDcon Dev Summit. We can find a volunteer to work on that.
Yeah. So for FreeBSD, you could also try looking at dtrace and finding more CPU-specific benchmarks there. This might be giving you some insight.
All right, let's get to the last question before we run out of time.
Yep. We're a bit of a rush here. The last one is from John. He's has a config question regarding the Dell Precision 7720, FreeBSD, NVMe, and ZFS. And he writes that he's been saving up for a few years and just ordered his dream laptop at Dell Precision 7720? 7720? Yeah, 7720. So it's going to be his main workstation to use in engineering and at university. I have a few questions regarding configuration and to use it with FreeBSD and ZFS. So
right,
here are the
we
specs.
don't need to read out his specs, but looking at his question, so he's got two M2 1 terabyte NVMe devices, and he plans to mirror them as his main ZFS pool. He says he hasn't used an NVMe device before, let alone using it with ZFS. I know that it should just work with ZFS, but I was wondering if it would have any issues booting off of it. That mostly depends on the BIOS in the NVMe, so maybe it'll work and maybe it won't. Worst case, you can make a USB stick with a boot partition to that will the BIOS will find and then just work. But in general, it should work. You'll just definitely have to use UEFI as your boot method, not BIOS.
Mm-hmm.
As far as recommendations for tuning to get the most out of the Z pool, you might need to increase the maximum concurrent commands. Look under vfs.zfs.vdev. There's a bunch of limits to how many outstanding commands there can be. These are tuned for spinning disks, and NVMe can have 64 concurrent commands running. So you could maybe increase the size of the queue a little bit to let a little bit more work get sent out to the drive at once.
Yeah,
But in general, I would expect that machine will be really fast.
As more and more NVMe devices are now entering the market, it will interesting to see what kind of performance we can get out of those.
Yes, I just bought a 32 gig Intel Optane type SSD or NVMe device to put in my home server, not for any particular reason other than I've not played with having a slog device before, and I would like to mess around with it a bit.
Okay. Yeah, or if you try this out, John, and have a little blog post about this, or like a user story about running this on FreeBSD, then we could cover it in a future show, maybe. Yeah, so this is the end of this show. If you have any questions, comments about the show ideas, any stories you might want to share, send it to feedback@bsdnow.tv, and we'll cover it in a future episode.
Yes, we look forward to hearing from you, and we will see you next week.